Hi guys, welcome back to AP Environmental Science. In today's video, we're going to be covering 4 different topics in this unit. We're going to be going over the nutrient cycles, which is how 4 different main elements or nutrients cycle through the biosphere. The first one that we're going to go over is the carbon cycle, which you should maybe be a little bit familiar with because you should have went over this in chemistry. If you did not, we're going to review it today. So the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon atoms within sources and sinks. And sources and sinks are going to be common terms throughout all of these different cycles. A source is how carbon is put back into the atmosphere, whereas a sink is something that takes carbon away from the atmosphere and is being stored. Some of these steps are very quick, such as fossil fuel combustion. FF from now on means fossil fuel. So fossil fuels are non-renewable resources such as coal and oil, and when they are burned, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is a rather quick process, so it's putting out a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a very fast rate. So this would be an anthropogenic, a human source of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, where some steps are very slow, such as sedimentation and burial. So because of this, we now have this imbalance where reservoirs or sinks are storing carbon in an unequal distribution or portion. That carbon is being put back into the atmosphere. And we should know from our last unit that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which contributes to global warming because it prevents the solar radiation from escaping our atmosphere. So the atmosphere is a very important carbon reservoir. Increasing levels of carbon in the atmosphere leads to global warming. So some sources of the carbon cycle, besides the burning of fossil fuels, natural sources, naturally occurring sources are going to be respiration. You should know by now that animals perform cellular respiration where they're breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. So that's a natural source of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Sinks are going to be anything that take away carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So if you look at the arrows, it's going to be arrows going away from the atmosphere. So photosynthesis, again, something you should know from bio. Photosynthesis, plants breathe in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Forests and oceans are going to be huge carbon sinks because of the photosynthetic organisms that live there. We actually get most of our oxygen from the ocean because there's so much photosynthetic organisms such as phytoplankton living near the surface. And sedimentation is when carbon dioxide combines with calcium in the water to form calcium carbonate, which is how shells are formed. So this relationship between carbon dioxide within the ocean and the atmosphere is really important in maintaining a balanced level of carbon dioxide. If you guys recall from our previous unit, the majority of the gas in our atmosphere is nitrogen. It's about 78%. The remaining 22-ish% is oxygen, and the remaining less than 1% are those trace gases such as the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. But because we are burning so many fossil fuels at such a fast rate, we are putting out so much carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And in turn, we are chopping down so many trees through deforestation that we're removing our carbon sinks, which take away carbon from the atmosphere. So this direct exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean and other carbon sinks, such as forests, is becoming incredibly imbalanced due to human activity. The last thing on this slide that I wanted to talk about is sedimentation. So this is, again, when you have carbon dioxide in the ocean that's going to combine with calcium carbonate to form things like shells. But when marine organisms die, their bodies sink to the ocean floor. They're broken down into sediments as well that contain carbon. And over really long periods of time, this carbon at the bottom of the ocean can be compressed and turned into things like limestone and sandstone. But this takes an incredibly long amount of time. And again, we are extracting some of these things, such as oil and coal, and burning them for fossil fuel usage for energy. So burial is a very slow geological process that stores carbon underground. Eventually, over time, these sediments get compressed into sedimentary rock or fossil fuels due to the pressure from the overlaying rock layers. And these fossil fuels are going to be coal, oil, and natural gas. So on the AP exam, if you encounter a question that said, what would be an anthropogenic or a human-caused source of carbon dioxide, it would be the burning or the combustion of fossil fuels. So this is just a review of everything we talked about. This is the human impact of the carbon cycle. I've been saying and saying and saying the burning of fossil fuels is the biggest impact of the carbon cycle. However, another thing you can discuss on the AP exam is deforestation. That's the permanent removal of trees to be replaced by other man-made structures. And remember, forests are carbon sinks because forests are photosynthetic, or they contain photosynthetic organisms that are going to be removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So if you don't want to discuss the burning of fossil fuels as a source of CO2, you can discuss deforestation as a way that carbon is no longer being removed from the atmosphere. So that was the carbon cycle. Let's move on to the nitrogen cycle, which is, again, another incredibly important cycle of nitrogen, which you guys should have learned a little bit about from our soil theories lab of why nitrogen is so important to plant growth. The nitrogen cycle is a little bit more complex and it has more steps, but it's the same kind of concept where it's the movement of nitrogen-containing molecules between sources and sinks. So sources, again, are going to release nitrogen into the atmosphere. Sinks take nitrogen away. Nitrogen reservoirs hold nitrogen for relatively short periods of time compared to the carbon cycle. So when we have our carbon cycle reservoirs or sinks, they tend to hold on to them for longer periods within the sediment for burial, whereas in the nitrogen cycle, they're not being stored for as long. And this is evident by the fact that our atmosphere contains so much nitrogen, an overwhelming majority of 78%. So the atmosphere is the main reservoir of nitrogen. It contains the most amount. Nitrogen in the atmosphere exists mostly as nitrogen gas, which is not usable by plants or animals. We do need nitrogen to exist, not in the form of a gas, and same thing, plants need nitrogen to exist, but not in the form of a gas. We cannot breathe it in. Our body cannot use it. Why do we need it? We need nitrogen to help build our DNA and amino acids to make proteins. So, how does nitrogen gas in the atmosphere be converted into a usable form? So the process of nitrogen gas being converted into a biologically available molecule, it's going to be converted into something called ammonia, which is NH3. It contains one nitrogen atom and 3 hydrogen atoms. And this is through the process of bacterial fixation. So there's bacteria that live in the soil, and they have this really great symbiotic relationship with plants where they convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. So these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, they don't always breathe in oxygen or carbon dioxide. Instead, they breathe in nitrogen, and they convert that nitrogen into ammonia. So this would be a great symbiotic relationship to talk about on the AP exam. It's also a favorite one that the exam likes to discuss. So this rhizobacteria live in the root nodules of legumes, which are beans and peas, and they fix or fixate nitrogen for the plants in return for the amino acids generated by the plant. So it's a nice symbiotic relationship. The bacteria give the plant usable nitrogen in the form of ammonia, and the plant gives the bacteria the amino acids that they create using that ammonia. So bacterial fixation would be a natural way that nitrogen is put into the soil. A synthetic or human way would be when humans combust or burn fossil fuels to convert nitrogen gas into nitrates. And this would be in fertilizers to help plants grow. So the nitrogen cycle has a few other key steps. The other one is assimilation. So this is going to be happening after nitrogen fixation. So again, nitrogen fixation is when you have nitrogen fixing bacteria in the root nodules of plants or in the soil. They take the atmospheric nitrogen and they convert it into a usable form. So it's going from nitrogen gas, N2, to ammonia, which is NH3. Then this form is now used by plants. So this is going to be assimilation, where the plants can take in the nitrogen, and incorporate it into their body. Ammonification is the soil bacteria, microbes, decomposers, converting waste and dead biomass back into NH3 and returning it to the soil. Nitrification is the conversion of NH4 into nitrites and then nitrates by soil bacteria. And denitrification is the opposite of nitrification, the conversion of soil nitrogen, which is NO3, into nitrous oxide gas, which then returns back into the atmosphere. So how do humans impact the nitrogen cycle? Nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas, which warms Earth's climate. We should know this from our last unit. It's normally produced by the denitrification of nitrates in agricultural soils. However, because we're putting in so much excess fertilizer, we now have an overwhelming majority of excess nitrogen in soils being converted into nitrous oxide, or we have an overwhelming amount of excess fertilizer leading to NH3 gas entering the atmosphere. NH3 gas can lead to acid rain, which we'll talk about later this year when we get to our air pollution unit. This also means that less nitrogen stays in the soil for crops to use, so we have actually a decreased plant growth. And the other big one is leaching and eutrophication. And some of you guys should be familiar with eutrophication if you covered it in Honors Bio last year. So synthetic fertilizer, man-made fertilizer, contains a lot of nitrates because, again, it helps plants grow by forming DNA and amino acids and proteins. So synthetic fertilizers use nitrates, and this can cause leaching, which is when the nitrates are carried out of the soil by water. And where does it go? It goes into local waters, causing huge algae blooms, which can block the sun and kill other aquatic plants. So these are just a few important terms that we're going to go over. A limiting nutrient is a nutrient that, when in low supply, will prevent, limit, or restrict the growth of an organism. Whenever you see this term in a test, they're asking about what nutrient is preventing an organism from growing or developing. Typically, nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting nutrients, which is why they're pumped so heavily into fertilizers to help plants grow. When you have an excess of nutrients in a lake or another body of water, you get this really dense growth of plant life, particularly algae blooms, which causes a huge layer of algae to be on top of the surface of the water. And because it's so dense and so thick, sunlight can't penetrate through. So anything that's living underneath this algal bloom is not going to get any sunlight to perform photosynthesis. Now, again, as a reminder, Plants do not just undergo photosynthesis, where they breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. Plants also do cellular respiration. It's something that we don't go over a lot in biology because it's hard enough to cover those two different topics. But plants also do cellular respiration. So when you have this huge growth of algae, not only are they going to be performing photosynthesis, they're going to be doing cellular respiration. So they're going to be breathing in all of the oxygen that's present in the water. That way, or that then results in other life in the water not having enough oxygen, such as fish, to breathe in to live. So this causes something called anoxia, which is a lack of oxygen in a body of water, which results in the death of animal and plant life. So an anthropogenic contributor to the carbon cycle would be the usage of fertilizers, and those fertilizers causing leaching or runoff into a body of water, resulting in eutrophication. Okay, that's all for this video. In the next one, we'll talk about the phosphorus cycle and the water cycle.